The mistress was seated in the family pew before Grace had finished walking up the aisle, and it was the seating, not the woman, that undid her. She would remember, long after, that she noticed the pew before she noticed the face in it, the good oak pew with the Ashcombe crest worked into the end panel, kept empty at every service for 40 years because no one but blood sat there. And today a stranger sat in it in blue silk with her gloved hands folded like a woman who belonged. She did not yet know what that folded stillness would cost her before the sun went down on Michaelmas Day. Had she known, she would have walked up the aisle regardless, because that was the shape of her, and it was already the shape she was about to prove, though not in the way anyone in that church expected. Julian stood at the rail with his back straight and his jaw set the way it set when he had decided something and would not be moved from it, and he did not look toward the pew even once, which she would later understand and could not, in that moment, forgive herself for missing. The vicar had his book open. The organ had gone quiet, the way organs go quiet when they are waiting to be told to begin again. Somewhere behind her, in the second row, Lady Honoria Wren's fan had stopped its small, furious motion, which was itself a kind of alarm bell, because Honoria Wren's fan did not stop for anything short of a death in the house. Grace felt, more than saw, the note pressed into her glove by her own maid Nan Coombs not 3 minutes before, folded so small it might have been a communion wafer, and she had opened it without thinking, the way one opens any small paper handed to one on the happiest morning of one's life, expecting nothing but a well wish. It had not been a well wish. It had been 4 lines in Julian's own hand, or a hand so like his that only a woman who had spent 11 years adding her father's columns twice before trusting them would have known to look twice at the loop of the G. She had looked twice. She had not, in the roaring of that moment, trusted what the second look told her, because the first look had already done its work, and the woman in blue silk was watching her now with an expression Grace could not read, and unread faces were the one column of her life she had never learned to balance. Today, in a church built for lighter griefs, she was about to close a book of promises before she had made a single one aloud. The vicar cleared his throat. Julian turned, finally, and his eyes found hers, and whatever he saw in them made the color go out of his face by degrees, the way light leaves a room when a cloud crosses. Not suddenly, but all at once you notice it is gone. "Dearly beloved," the vicar began, "we are gathered together." Grace looked once more at the pew, at the woman's gloved hand resting where a sister or a daughter or a wife would rest a hand, at Julian's face gone the color of old paper, and she did the only thing her father had ever taught her to do when a column would not balance, no matter how she added it. She closed the book in her hands, the little prayer book with her mother's initials tooled into the cover that Honoria had pressed on her that morning with the words, "Keep this. It will steady your hands." And she turned, and she walked back down the aisle the way she had come, past 40 pews of county families who would talk of nothing else until Christmas, and she did not run. Because running would have given them a story about a woman who lost her composure, and she was not going to give them that story on top of the other one. Outside, the church bells were still ringing for the hour, indifferent to what had just happened 3 feet from the altar, and a wren was singing in the yew by the lick gate as though nothing in the world required its attention but its own small song, and Grace stood in the September light with her mother's prayer book in both hands and understood. With the particular cruelty of hindsight arriving 4 seconds too late to be of use, that she had just refused to marry a man for a reason she could not yet prove was true. It would be some months before she understood that neither could he, not fully, not that morning, because the truth he had been carrying into that church was not his alone to spend, and a man who has spent his whole life guarding another person's ruin does not always remember, in time, that silence protects no one so well as it protects the liar it was never meant to shield. But that is to run ahead of the story, and this is not a story that rewards running ahead. It began, as these things generally do, a good deal more quietly, 3 months before, in a room that smelled of beeswax and old ink, with a woman counting another family's money because it was the only skill her father had left her, and a man standing in the doorway of that room with mud on his boots and a question he had not expected to need to ask twice. Grace Talent had come to Cardwell Park in June, engaged by Lady Honoria Wren to set the household accounts to rights after the previous man of business had proved better at billiards than bookkeeping, and she had been at the ledgers 11 days, restacking 3 years of muddled entries into columns that would finally agree with themselves when the Earl of Cardwell came in from the stables smelling of leather and horse and stood in the doorway with his hat still in his hand. "Miss Talent," he said, "my aunt tells me you have found an error in the tenant rents." "I have found several, my lord," she said, without looking up, because she had learned that men who owned houses like this one did not care to be flattered and cared less to be lied to, and the surest way to keep both graces was to answer plainly and keep working. He came further into the room. "Show me," he said, and it was not a request, though neither was it unkind, and she turned the ledger to face him and set her finger under the column. "Here," she said, "the tenant at Ashen Farm is recorded as paying £12 at Lady Day, and again at Midsummer, but the receipt book shows only one payment collected. Someone has entered the same £12 twice, either by carelessness or by design, and I have not yet decided which." He studied the page a long while, long enough that she began totaling the next column rather than watch him do it. And when he spoke again, his voice had gone very even, the particular evenness of a man setting down a weight so as not to let it show on his face. "Carelessness, I could forgive." "And design, my lord?" she asked. "Then I should want to know whose," he said, and closed the ledger himself, gently, the way a man closes a door he does not wish to slam. "You are frank, Miss Talent. My father kept books for a shipping house until he died of it," she said. "He taught me that a column will forgive you anything except being trusted before it is added twice." "And a face?" he asked, and there was, for the first time, something almost like humor at the corner of his mouth. "A face is worse," she said. "A column at least holds still while you count it." That earned her a longer look than she expected, and she did not flinch from it, because she had spent 11 days learning that this was a man who mistook stillness for weakness in no one, least of all in himself, and she preferred to be misjudged as bold than as biddable. "I will not ask you to take anything on faith you have not first been allowed to weigh," he said then, so quietly she almost missed it, and she did not understand that first week that he was not speaking only of ledgers. Lady Honoria, arriving in the doorway in time to catch the last of it, rapped her cane once against the floor, a habit that meant either delight or displeasure, and frequently both. "Well," she said, "you have found the one person in this county who will contradict you before breakfast. Julian, you had better marry her before someone less honest gets to you first." "My lord's aunt," Grace said afterward, alone with the ledgers again, "has a talent for saying the truest thing in the room as though it were a joke, so that no one has to decide whether to be alarmed by it." She did not yet know how often, in that house, jokes would turn out to be the truest things anyone dared to say aloud. The second time they spoke alone, it was raining, and he had come in from mending a strap of harness leather with his own hands rather than send for the saddler. "Because," he said, "a man ought to know how to mend what he depends upon," and she had looked at the calluses on his palm and thought that no earl of her father's imagining had ever had hands like that. You keep your own accounts too, she said, nodding at the estate books stacked beside her own private ledger, the one in which she recorded her wages and her small economies, because habits of care did not stop merely because the sums grew larger. I keep what I can see with my own eyes, he said. My father trusted a great deal to men he did not watch closely enough, and it cost this family more than money. What did it cost, my lord? She asked, and watched him decide, in real time, how much of the answer she was permitted. There is a debt from my father's years that I must settle before I am free to call myself entirely my own man, he said. I cannot yet tell you the shape of it. I am not free to, but I will tell you this much, so that you are not left guessing in the dark about my character. If nothing else, there is someone I am bound to protect, and the protecting is not dishonorable, whatever it may look like from the outside before it is finished. She turned that over as carefully as she turned over any figure that did not immediately reconcile. Bound how, my lord? By blood, he said, and by a promise made over a grave, and I will say no more of it tonight, except that I would rather you know me slowly and truly than quickly and wrong, and I am asking you to trust that there is a true account to be given, even on the days when I cannot yet give it. It was, she would think later, the fairest warning any man had ever given a woman before breaking her heart a little, and the trouble was that a warning, however fair, cannot by itself prevent the thing it warns of. Lady Honoria, that same week, took her arm on the way in to dinner and said, apropos of nothing, that a family is not the name carved over the door. It is who you choose to seat inside it, and Grace, not yet knowing why the old woman had chosen that particular morning to say it, merely agreed that it was a handsome sentiment, and thought no more of it, because she did not yet know that Cardwell Park was keeping, in a cottage 2 miles off in the village of Aldbourne, a secret the size of a whole second family. Tended quietly for years by a man who had decided, alone, that he alone should carry the weight of it. By August, the household had settled into the particular rhythm of a great house, working out whether it approved of a new addition, and Grace had learned the names of the maids and the moods of the dogs, and the precise hour at which Lady Honoria's temper improved with tea. And she had also learned, without meaning to, the sound of Cousin Simon Vane's voice, which was the gentlest voice in any room he entered, and which she had come to distrust more than any raised one. Mr. Vane managed the estate's rents and its correspondence, and had done so competently by all report since before the old Earl died, and he had a way of complimenting a woman that left her feeling she had been quietly priced and found wanting. Miss Talent keeps such very tidy columns, he said one evening, for a woman raised to nothing grander than a merchant's back room. For a man raised to nothing grander than a steward's ledger, she replied. You keep remarkably fine cuffs, Mr. Vane, and watched him smooth them. An odd little vanity of a gesture, the smoothing of a cuff, before he answered with a smile that did not reach any part of his face above the mouth. I only observe, he said, that the Earl has grown fond of frank women of late. Frankness runs in this house, it seems, she said, and did not look away, and he inclined his head and left her to her columns, and it was some weeks before she understood that the flicker behind his eyes in that exchange had not been mere condescension, but something nearer to calculation, a man taking the measure of an obstacle rather than a curiosity. That same week, going over the quarter's accounts at Lady Honoria's request, she found, in among the tenant rents and the tradesmen's bills, a recurring entry for £18 a quarter, paid out under the Heading Garden annuity, to no name at all, only the initials R.F., and when she asked Mr. Vane about it, he told her, with the gentlest voice in the room, that it was an old pension left by the late Earl to a retired gardener's widow, a kindness continued out of loyalty. Nothing worth troubling the new countess over. She wrote it down and did not trouble anyone over it, because a woman new to a great house learns early which doors are locked out of neglect and which are locked on purpose, and she had not yet learned to tell the two apart in this particular house. She noticed only, and filed away the way she filed every unreconciled figure, that £18 was a great deal of pension for a gardener's widow, and that Mr. Vane's cuffs had wanted smoothing twice in the course of one short answer. It was in September. With the wedding 6 weeks off and the whole county already sharpening its gossip over the match, that Grace first heard the name Rosalind Fenn, and heard it the wrong way, which is to say she heard it through a closed door rather than an open one. She had gone to the estate office after dark to return a set of keys and found the door not quite shut and Julian's voice inside it. Low and urgent in a register she had never heard him use, saying, "You must let me do this my way, Rosalind. I have carried it alone long enough, and I will not have you carry the whole of it now on top of everything else." A woman's voice, younger than she expected, answered him with something too quiet to catch, and then his again gentler, "You are not asking to be spared. You are asking to remain invisible, and I understand why. God knows I understand why. But invisibility has a price too, and I think the reckoning for it has come whether either of us is ready or not." Grace withdrew from the door before she could hear more, ashamed of having heard even that much, and told herself, quite reasonably, that a man of affairs might have 100 unremarkable reasons to speak urgently with a woman named Rosalind behind a closed door, and that eavesdropping was a poor foundation for any conclusion, and she very nearly convinced herself of it. But that same night, unable to sleep, she took out her father's old lesson and applied it where it did not belong, adding the column of evidence twice in her head, the initials on the garden annuity, the low, urgent voice behind the door, the visits to Aldbourne that Julian made once a fortnight, and never explained beyond an old obligation of my father's, the fact that he had told her plainly there was someone he was bound to protect by blood and by a promise made over a grave. And the sum she arrived at was not the true sum, though it used all the true figures to arrive at the false one, which is, her father used to say, the most dangerous kind of error there is, the kind built entirely out of honest numbers wrongly placed. She said nothing of it to Julian. She told herself she was waiting for him to give her the account he had promised, slowly and truly, and she did not yet understand that a promise like that has its own deadline, unspoken but absolute, and that his was closing in on him a good deal faster than either of them knew. The blow came, as blows in that house tended to come, at a moment designed to look like kindness. Lady Honoria's oldest friend, a Mrs. Petch, given to charitable works and uncharitable conversation, called at Cardwell Park in the 3rd week of September and drew Grace aside over the tea things with a particular gentleness reserved for delivering bad news to someone thought too innocent to have earned it plainly. "My dear," she said, "I would not for the world distress you before your wedding, but I have known this family 30 years, and I think a friend owes you the truth rather than the silence everyone else is keeping. The Earl visits a woman in Aldbourne, has done for years, pays her rent and her keep under his aunt's very roof accounts, and no one in this county has ever been told why, and I think it unkind that you should walk to that altar, the only person in the room who does not know her name." Grace set down her cup with great care, because her hands wished to shake, and she would not permit them. "What is her name?" she asked, and heard, for the second time, Rosalind. That evening she went to Julian directly, because, whatever else she was not a woman who let a wound fester unexamined, and she found him in the estate office with Simon Vane's ledgers spread before him, and a look on his face she had not seen before, the look of a man doing sums that refused to balance no matter how many times he added them. "I have heard a name today," she said. Rosalind Fenn. I should like you to tell me, plainly, who she is to you, because I find I have collected a great many true facts about her these last weeks and arranged them into a shape I do not think I can marry into blind. He looked at her a long moment, and she watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the same calculation, though she did not know it, that Simon Vane's cuff-smoothing courtesy always concealed, except that in Julian's case, the calculation was not cruelty, but grief, weighing what he owed her against what he had sworn to another. I cannot tell you the whole of it yet, he said at last, and every word of it costs me to say. Not because I do not trust you, Grace, because it is not entirely my truth to give away. There is a woman who has borne a great injury from this family in silence for 20 years, and I have sworn to her that when the truth is finally told, it will be told on her terms and no one else's, in her own time. And I am so close now to being able to keep that oath without breaking either of us that I am asking you, for a few weeks more, to let me carry it a little further before you judge the shape of what you cannot yet see whole. It is a strange thing to be asked to trust a debt you have never been shown, she said. It is, he agreed. I would rather you know me slowly and truly than quickly and wrong. I told you that in June. I am telling you again now, because it is still the truest thing I have to offer you, and I am aware it is not enough, and I am asking for it anyway. She did not close the door on him that night. She told herself later that this was the mistake, not the walking away in the church, but the staying quiet in the office, though in fact it had been neither courage nor error, but simply love doing what love does when it has been asked, by someone it trusts more than it trusts its own arithmetic, to wait a little longer for the sum to come right. Lady Honoria, that same week, took her arm again and said that a family is not the name carved over the door, it is who you choose to seat inside it. And Grace, not yet knowing why the old woman had chosen that particular morning to say it, merely agreed that it was a handsome sentiment, and thought no more of it. Simon Vane had by then his own sums to protect, and they were a good deal less honorable than Julian's. He had managed the Cardwell rents for 11 years, since before the old Earl's death, and in that time he had built, entry by careful entry, a second ledger beneath the true one, skimming a shilling here and a pound there from tenant rents and timber sales, and the very garden annuity Grace had puzzled over, enough over the years to have quietly bought back, under a borrowed name, a parcel of the land his own branch of the family had lost 2 generations before, when his grandfather's elder brother was disinherited for marrying a woman without a fortune. He had grown up on the story of that old injustice at his father's knee the way other children grow up on fairy tales, and it had taught him precisely one lesson, which was that the difference between his cousin's comfort and his own diminishment was a piece of paper signed 100 years ago by a man who was dead and could not be argued with, and that if paper had made the wrong, paper might yet unmake it. He had discovered Rosalind Fenn's existence 3 years before, quite by accident, going through the late Earl's private correspondence for the settlement of an old debt, and he had understood at once what he held, a bastard daughter of the old Earl's, born to a woman the family had disowned to her grave, kept now in quiet comfort by the son who had inherited the guilt along with the estate. It was, Simon knew, precisely the kind of scandal that could ruin a family's standing in a county that forgave a great deal, but not hypocrisy dressed as virtue, and precisely the kind of secret a careful man could use to buy himself time, and time, that autumn, was the one thing Simon Vane needed above every other commodity in the world. Because the old Earl's will was explicit on one point above all others: if Julian was not lawfully married by his 30th birthday, which fell that year on Michaelmas Day, the management of the entire estate and its revenues would pass, for the whole of Julian's natural life, to the nearest adult male relation, named as contingent trustee, and that relation was Simon Vane. Simon had done the sum on that clause 100 times since the old Earl's funeral, adding it twice himself in his own fashion, and each time it came out the same, that a delayed wedding was worth more to him than the whole of his salary for a decade, and that a scandal large enough to make a bride's family withdraw its blessing, or a bride herself withdraw her hand, needed only to be timed correctly to do the work of 10 years' embezzlement in a single afternoon. He made his approach to Julian in the last week of September in the estate office, with the door shut and his voice at its gentlest. "Cousin," he said, "I have come across some old letters of your father's that I think you would rather the county did not see, concerning a Mrs. Fenn of Aldbourne and a certain young person she left behind her. I have no wish to be indelicate. I only observe that a man about to be married would find it inconvenient, at best, for such papers to find their way into idle hands before the wedding, and I am prepared to be discreet, as I have always been discreet, provided we can agree between us on some small accommodation regarding the management of the trust once you are married. An accommodation that costs you very little and spares us both a great deal of unpleasantness." Julian did not raise his voice. He had never needed to, in all the years Grace would come to know him, and he did not begin the habit now. "You are asking me to buy your silence about my sister with control of my own house," he said. "I am asking you to be sensible," Simon said, and smoothed his cuff. And there was, in that small, vain gesture, something Julian alone among the household might have recognized, though he did not yet think to look for it, as the same gesture his own late father had made whenever he was ashamed of himself and determined not to show it. "I will not be blackmailed over Rosalind," Julian said. "I have spent 20 years keeping her out of exactly this kind of use. You will not spend her as a coin, Simon, not to me, not to anyone. And if you think I will trade my aunt's house and my father's name for one more season of your convenience, you have mistaken your man entirely." "Then I am sorry for what must follow," Simon said, quite gently, and Julian, watching him go, understood that he had just handed his enemy a deadline sharper than the one already carved into his father's will, and that whatever Simon Vane did next, he would do it before Michaelmas, and he would do it in public, where it could not be quietly undone. Julian went to Rosalind that same night, in the cottage at Aldbourne, where she had lived since childhood on his quiet keeping, and found her at her needlework by the window, with the locket she always wore closed at her throat, the one with her mother's portrait inside it, and the Ashcombe crest worked into the clasp, the one true thing the old Earl had ever given the woman he wronged. "I have kept you hidden to spare you," he told her, "and I have only just understood that hiding you has made you spendable in a way that owning you never could. Simon means to use your name to stop my marriage, and I would rather lose the estate entire than let him spend you for it, but I think there is only one way left to take the coin out of his hand, and that is to make you a secret no longer, before he can make you a scandal." Rosalind's hands had gone still over her stitching. "You would seat me among your family," she said, "at your own wedding, in front of the whole county, after 20 years of my mother's grave, going unvisited by anyone who was ashamed to be seen visiting it." "I would," he said, "if you will let me. I have asked you to stay hidden all these years because I thought it was what you wanted, and because it was easier for me than confessing my father's cruelty to a church full of strangers, and I see now that the easier course for me was never truly the kinder one for you." She was a long while answering, and when she did, her voice had the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided to be brave a moment before she has finished being afraid. "Then let it be at the wedding," she said, "in the family pew, where your mother's family always sat, because if I am to be looked at last, I would rather be looked at as someone's sister than as someone's shame. He had meant to tell Grace that same week. He had gone twice to find her with the words arranged, and twice been interrupted, once by his aunt's arrival with a question about the flowers, once by a message from the lawyer that could not wait, and each time he had told himself there would be another evening, not understanding that Simon Vane, having been refused, was no longer content merely to threaten, and that the days remaining before Michaelmas had narrowed to almost nothing. Simon Vane's clerk, a quiet young man named Thomas Reeve, who kept the estate's fair copies and owed a gambling debt to a man not known for his patience, was given, 4 days before the wedding, a single sheet of paper and a single instruction: copy this in his lordship's hand, as near as you are able, and say nothing to anyone of it, and your debt is discharged the same evening. The letter Reeve copied was Simon's own composition, 4 lines of the tenderest endearments addressed to my dearest R, promising a life together once certain difficulties were behind them, signed with a flourish that mimicked, well enough to deceive an unsuspecting eye, Julian's own hand. It was given, in turn, to Nan Coombs, Grace's own maid, with £10 and a story about a keepsake mislaid and wanting returned to its owner discreetly on the wedding morning, and Nan, who needed the £10 a great deal more than she needed to examine the story too closely, agreed to place it in Grace's glove before the ceremony, and say nothing more than that it had been found and ought to be seen before, not after, the vows were spoken. It was, Simon judged, adding the sum twice in his own careful fashion, a scheme requiring no violence, no forgery a court could easily unpick, and no player who could name him with certainty as its author, only a letter arriving at precisely the moment a stranger sat down in a pew reserved for family, so that 2 true and separate facts might collide in one heart and produce, between them, a false and devastating sum. He was not wrong about the arithmetic. He had simply, as men of his kind so often do, mistaken a woman's silence for the whole of her arithmetic, forgetting that Grace Talent had spent her whole life learning never to trust a column, however convincing, until she had added it a second time in quiet, and that the closing of a prayer book is not always the closing of a question. The days after the wedding that did not happen passed for Grace in the particular fog that follows any public wound, in which the body continues its ordinary business, dressing and eating and answering letters, while some other part of the self stands apart from all of it. Still standing in the church doorway, still holding the closed book. Lady Honoria took her in without a single question asked aloud, which was itself its own kind of mercy, and installed her in the small blue room at the end of the east passage with the words, "You will stay here until your own mind is settled, whatever that mind decides, and I will hear no argument about it from you or from my nephew." Julian came twice to the door of that room in the first 3 days and was twice refused, not out of anger, Grace told herself, though anger was certainly present, but out of the same instinct that would not let her sign a ledger she had only added once. On the 3rd evening he did not knock but sent, instead, a single line by Lady Honoria's own hand. "I would not ask you to believe me on my word alone, not now. I am only asking you to let me show you the account, entire, before you close the book on it for good." It was, Grace thought, turning the letter over in the lamplight, precisely the promise he had made her in June, in the estate office, over a ledger neither of them had known yet would matter so much, and it undid her a little to be reminded that he had warned her, fairly, of exactly the weight she now found so unbearable. She did not answer that night. She sat instead with her father's old lesson and forced herself, for the first time since the church, to add the column properly, out loud, alone, the way he had taught her, the letter in her glove, and where it had come from, the woman in the pew, and the stillness of her folded hands, which had not, on reflection, been the stillness of triumph, but something nearer to fright. Julian's face going the color of old paper, which a guilty man does not generally do at the moment his guilt is discovered, because a guilty man has had time to prepare his face, and an innocent one has not. And beneath all of it, the plain, unexamined fact that Nan Coombs had been unusually flush with coin that same week, enough to buy herself a new bonnet she could not otherwise have afforded. A fact Grace had noticed, and, in the noise of her own grief, entirely failed to add. She went to Simon Vane the following morning, not because she suspected him yet with any certainty, but because a woman who has been taught to distrust a column does not stop at distrusting the sum that hurt her. She distrusts every sum in the same hand, and Simon Vane kept every hand in that house that touched money. She found him in the estate office, composing correspondence with his usual gentle industry, and she set the forged letter on the desk before him without preamble. "I wonder, Miss Vane, whether you would look at this and tell me, in your professional capacity, whose hand you believe it to be," she said, and watched him. He glanced at it and smoothed his cuff, and said, without any visible disturbance at all, "Why, it looks very like his lordship's hand to me. Poor girl, I am sorry you have had to see it." "And do you make a habit," she asked, "of studying his lordship's hand so closely that you would know it at a glance, apart from your own bookkeeping?" "Naturally, Miss Talent, I countersign his correspondence weekly," he said, and it was a perfectly reasonable answer, delivered in a perfectly gentle voice, and it was only because she had spent 3 months learning to read the small, vain gesture of his cuff, the way she read a column that would not balance, that she understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the season. That she had just watched a guilty man tell the truth about his method while lying about his motive, and that the difference between the two was the whole of what she still needed to prove. "I see," she said, and thanked him, and took the letter away again, and did not tell him what she had begun, that same hour, to suspect, because a column caught only once proves nothing, and she had 11 days left before the trust clause in the old Earl's will closed forever on Michaelmas, though she did not yet know the shape of that particular deadline, only that some clock in that house was running faster than her own grief, and that if she meant to be of any use to the truth at all, she would have to move faster than her sorrow allowed. It was Lady Honoria who supplied the missing figure. 2 days later, over tea, neither of them touched. "My dear," she said, "I have held my tongue a great deal longer than is natural to me, because I judged it was Julian's tale to tell and not mine to spoil, but I begin to think silence has done this family more harm this month than plain speaking could possibly do now. There is a will, and a clause in it, and a date, and I think you had better hear the whole of the arithmetic from me before you decide anything further about my nephew's character." She told it plainly, the 30th birthday clause, the contingent trusteeship, Simon's 11 years of careful management, and Grace, listening, felt the last column of the sum arrange itself into a shape she could finally trust, because it explained not only what Simon Vane had to gain, but why he had needed the wedding stopped on that particular day, and no other. "And Rosalind Fenn," Grace said. "Is his sister," said Lady Honoria, quietly now, "the old Earl's daughter by a woman this family disowned to her grave, and my nephew has spent every shilling of discretion he owns protecting her from precisely the use Simon Vane has now made of her. And he has done it, God forgive him, so quietly that he forgot to protect the one person closest to him from being wounded by his own silence." "Then I have been very stupid," Grace said. "You have been very young," said Lady Honoria, "which is a different failing and a kinder one, and it is not too late to be clever about it now, if you are willing to be." "I should like to see Mr. Vane's true ledgers," Grace said, "the ones beneath the ones he shows the family, because a man who forges a letter in another man's hand has generally had a great deal of practice forging other things first, and I do not believe I am the only column in this house he has ever doubled. Lady Honoria's fan, for the first time in days, began its small, furious motion again, which Grace had learned to recognize, by now, as the sound of an old woman deciding to be dangerous. It was Cordelia Vane, of all people, who opened the door that Grace could not open herself. Simon's sister had disliked Grace on sight months before, judging her a companion's daughter reaching above a station she had no right to occupy, and had said as much, more than once, in company calculated to sting, and Grace had never expected help from that quarter and asked for none. But Cordelia had watched her brother closely enough, over 11 years of sharing his house and his confidences, to have long suspected what his gentleness concealed, and she had watched, too, the wedding that did not happen. And something in the sight of a woman walking alone back down an aisle in front of 40 families who would talk of nothing else until Christmas had lodged itself uncomfortably close to her own conscience. She came to the blue room at the end of the East Passage on a wet evening near the end of the week, and stood in the doorway a long moment before she spoke. "I have despised you rather thoroughly since June," she said, "which I imagine you noticed, and I have come to tell you that I believe I have despised the wrong person for the wrong reason, and I find I do not care for the taste of that discovery, but I would rather swallow it than let it sit. My brother keeps a second set of books in the false bottom of the deed box in the estate office," she said. "I have known it for 2 years and told no one, because he is my brother, and because I judged, wrongly, that his sins were his own business, and none of mine to weigh. I judge differently now. I will not steal them for you, but I will tell you where they are, and I will stand as a witness to having told you, if it comes to that, because I find I would rather be the kind of woman who corrects a debt late than the kind who never corrects it at all." It was, Grace thought, watching her go, the first wholly honest thing Cordelia Vane had ever said to her, and she recognized in it, without yet having the words for the recognition, the particular shape of a person choosing, at real cost to her own comfort, to add a column she had long preferred to leave untotaled. The deed box, when Grace and Lady Honoria opened it together 3 nights later, with a key borrowed from the old butler's ring and a great deal of held breath, held exactly what Cordelia had promised, and one thing more besides. Beneath the false bottom, alongside a second ledger recording 11 years of quietly doubled entries, lay a bundle of the old Earl's letters to Rosalind's mother, acknowledging paternity in his own hand, letters Simon must have taken from among the papers he had used to first learn her secret and kept back as further leverage, and beneath those, folded small, a single sheet in Simon's own hand, unfinished, a draft never sent, instructing someone unnamed to see that a certain letter reaches Miss Tallant's glove before the ceremony and not after, timing being, he had written, "The whole of the art." Grace read that line twice, out loud, alone in the lamplight, the way her father had taught her to read any figure she meant to trust, with something that mattered, and found that it balanced. She sat with it a long while before she went to find Julian, not because she doubted any longer what it proved, but because she wished, for her own sake as much as his, to be entirely certain of her own arithmetic before she let it change anything further between them. When she did find him, in the estate office, working alone over papers he could no longer make sense of, she set the draft before him without a word, and watched him read it, and watched the color that had left his face in the church begin, slowly, to return to it. "I should have told you everything the first night you asked," he said. "I told myself I was protecting Rosalind, I think now I was also protecting myself from watching your face while I confessed what my father was. And that is a coward's economy, however I dress it up, and I am sorry for the cost of it landed on you instead of on me, where it belonged. I would rather you know me slowly and truly, she said, than quickly and wrong, and watched him recognize his own words handed back to him, and watched something in his shoulders that had been braced since the church began, for the first time in 11 days, to ease. I am not yet finished being angry, she said. But I have added the column twice now, and I find it balances in your favor, and I think there is a reckoning still owed in that church, in front of the same 40 families, before either of us is entitled to be at peace about it. They brought Simon Vane to account 9 days later, on a Sunday, in the same church, before as much of the same congregation as could be gathered on a fortnight's notice, because Lady Honoria had judged, correctly, that a wrong done publicly required its undoing to be public too, and had arranged the whole of it with the local magistrate, a level, unhurried man named Mr. Aldous, who had known the family 30 years and owed his honesty to no one's favor. They did not call it a trial, because no crime had yet been formally charged, only a family matter requiring witnesses, but it wore, by the time the doors were shut, every feature of one. Simon came in composed, his cuffs immaculate, and took his seat with the particular stillness of a man who has rehearsed his own innocence until it feels, to him, indistinguishable from the truth. Grace rose first, and set upon the reading desk 3 things: the forged letter that had been placed in her glove, the unfinished draft in Simon's own hand instructing its delivery, and the second ledger with its 11 years of doubled entries laid open to the page recording the garden annuity, inflated year upon year beyond whatever sum had ever truly reached Aldbourne. I will not ask you to take my word for whose hand wrote which of these, she said to the room at large, because I have spent a great deal of my life learning that a column, however confidently presented, is worth nothing until it has been added twice by someone with no reason to want it to come out a particular way. I ask instead that Mr. Aldous compare the hands himself in the light before witnesses, and that Mr. Vane's own clerk be asked, under oath, who held the pen. Thomas Reeve, brought forward pale and shaking, held out a full quarter-minute under Mr. Aldous's single quiet question, who instructed you to copy his lordship's hand, and for what payment. Before his composure broke entirely, and he named Simon Vane in a rush of words that could not, once spoken, be called back. A murmur went through the church like wind finding a gap in a hedge. Simon did not rise, and did not raise his voice, though something in his gentle mask had begun, visibly now, to slip. I did what any man does who has watched what should have been his spent on someone else's comfort for 2 generations, he said. And there was, for one unguarded moment, real grief under the gentleness, the grief of a boy raised on the story of his own family's disinheritance until it had hardened into the only shape his life was permitted to take. My father died believing this house was stolen from him by a piece of paper 100 years old, and I have kept its accounts for 11 years, like a servant in a house that should have been mine, and I do not ask anyone here to forgive that, only to understand that it was never only greed. Julian, watching him, did not raise his own voice either. I understand it better than you know, he said. I have spent my whole life paying for my father's wrongs without ever once being asked whether I wished to inherit the debt, and I did not choose to answer that inheritance by ruining another person's happiness to balance my own account. That is the whole of the difference between us, Simon, and it is not a small one. Mr. Aldous, having examined the hands and heard the clerk's confession and read Rosalind's mother's letters aloud, in the end, so that the whole church heard in the old earl's own words the paternity he had never publicly owned, delivered his finding plainly, that Simon Vane had forged a document to deceive a bride on her wedding day and falsified estate accounts for personal gain across a decade, and that either matter, pursued to the full extent the law allowed, would end in transportation or worse. It was Julian who asked for mercy instead, and Rosalind, rising from the family pew where she had sat all morning in plain gray, rather than blue silk, who seconded him. "I have been made a weapon once already in this business," she said, and her voice did not shake, though the church had gone very quiet to hear it. "I will not be made the reason a man is destroyed as well as ruined. Let him go from this county with enough to live modestly and never return to it, and let that be the whole of his punishment, because I find I would rather be known, at last, as someone's sister than as someone's revenge." Simon Vane left Cardwell Park within the fortnight with a small allowance and no further claim on the estate, and if he ever understood how nearly his own grief had made him almost sympathetic to the room that condemned him, he gave no sign of it before he went, though Cordelia, who chose to stay and rebuild what honesty she could among the neighbors her brother had cost her, wept for him once, privately, in a way she permitted no one to see. Julian came to Grace that same evening in the garden behind the house, where the last of the roses were going over and a wren was singing, unconcerned, in the hedge, and he did not go down on one knee, because they had already been through a wedding once, and he judged, rightly, that this moment wanted honesty more than ceremony. "I am not asking you to marry me because the trust clause still stands, and Michaelmas has come and gone and cost me the whole of it," he said, for the deadline had passed unmet in the confusion of the reckoning, and the estate's management had in fact reverted, temporarily, to the honest oversight of Mr. Aldous himself pending the courts, which Julian found, to his own surprise, he did not much mind. "I have lost the house's free management for now, and I find I would rather lose it twice over than have you think, for even 1 hour, that you are the means by which I am trying to win it back. I am asking you to marry me because you are the one person in my life who has never once let me get away with an unadded column, and because I would rather be poor and honestly loved than rich and quietly forgiven. And because I have carried enough of other people's secrets alone to have learned, finally, the difference between protecting someone and simply failing to trust them with the truth. Marry me then, for no better reason than that you wish it," she said. "It is the only reason I will take, now or ever, from any man, and I have added that particular column more times than any other in my life, and it still comes out the same." "A family," said Lady Honoria, arriving with her cane and her fan and impeccable timing, "is not the name carved over a door. It is who you choose to seat inside it, and I have said as much to this girl since June, though she was too busy being right about ledgers to hear me being right about people." They were married the second time in October, quietly, in the same church, with no more than 30 guests and no pew left empty on either side, Rosalind seated among the family without a single blue silk gown or a single folded glove of falsehood anywhere near her, and Nan Coombs, who had wept and confessed her own small part in the scheme and been forgiven on the condition of honest service, ever after cried openly through the whole of the vows and blamed it, unconvincingly, on the incense. Thomas Reeve paid off his debt honestly at last, in the new steward's employ, a post Mr. Aldous saw fit to grant him once his gambling was behind him. Cordelia Vane married, the following spring, a quiet widowed farmer 3 parishes over, who had never once heard of the scandal and did not care to when he did, and wrote to Grace once a year afterward, faithfully, with news of her children and no trace left of her old disdain. Rosalind kept her cottage at Aldbourne, but was seen, from that autumn forward, At every dinner and every service the family attended, her locket worn openly now at her throat instead of hidden beneath her collar, and she painted, in time, a portrait of her mother from memory and hung it in the gallery beside the old Earl's, which Julian judged, when he first saw it finished, the truest reconciliation the house had ever managed. A year turned, almost to the week, and on a bright Michaelmas morning, very like the one that had nearly broken her, Grace walked into that same church again, this time simply to hear the harvest service, with a child not yet 3 months old asleep against her shoulder, and paused, as she always paused now, at the family pew, and found Rosalind already seated there with room left beside her, and took it, and reached back without turning to draw Julian in after her, and thought, watching the light fall through the high windows onto 4 generations of one imperfect, honestly kept family, that a family is not, after all, the name carved over any door, but who you choose, in the end, to seat beside you, and choose again every ordinary Sunday afterward for no better reason than that you wish it. And if this story warmed you the way a well-kept house warms a traveler who was not sure of his welcome, you know already where to find us of an evening, here at the Hearth and Ledger, where the kettle is always on and a chair is always kept by the fire for one more. Tell me, in the room below, which moment you would have forgiven first, the ledger or the letter, and stay a while longer if you can spare it, and keep your place among us by subscribing so the fire is lit again next time we have a story worth telling. Sleep well tonight, and add your own columns twice before you believe the worst of anyone you love.